Welcome to the wall towns of the Stour Valley. It's an inspirational landscape of gentle hills, lush meadows, and beautiful villages surrounding the River Stour. It's a landscape that continues to entice many visitors today for its beauty, and it's also a landscape that has inspired many artists over the years, including Thomas Gainsborough, Alfred Munnings, and of course John Constable, who in his paintings has immortalised forever the scenes along the River Stour. As the river weaves its way through the countryside, it also weaves its way through many towns and villages full of timber-framed houses, thatched cottages and huge medieval churches. And this is what we are focusing on, the quaint, quintessential towns that dot our landscape that are collectively known as the wall towns. Their tale is a fascinating history of money and enterprise that has left behind its beautiful and majestic mark on our countryside today. It's a story of trade. Even the River Stour itself is a working river. An act of navigation in 1705 made the river navigable from Sudbury to the sea at a time when the railway had not even been heard of. In fact, a lot of John Constable's paintings along the Stour are of the working life on the river. Trade was important, as indeed trade had been important many years before. In medieval times, the area prospered trading in and making woolen cloth, and the cloth was made so well people became wealthy due to the cloth trade. With money coming into the area, people wanted to build fine houses to live in and, of course, show off their wealth. And they used the building materials which were readily available to them. Timber for houses, thatch for roofs. They also wanted to build big churches to the glory of God. We are fortunate that so many of these buildings remain for us to see today, because after the cloth trade declined, people did not have the money to alter or rebuild their homes. Today it's delightful to stand in these villages and take a step back in time, but a most up-to-date and warm welcome is shown in each place, with many cafes, pubs, restaurants, shops and museums nestling amongst the old and new. Come with us as we explore the wall towns. Welcome! My name is Clare and this is Ian, and together we are Guide East, and we are tour guides for the east of England, regularly taking visitors around this area. We're in Lavenham, and this is often considered the best preserved medieval village in the country. There are over 300 listed buildings in this village alone.
And we are currently standing in the Lavenham marketplace next to the market cross. Lavenham received its market charter in the 13th century and also received a licence for 4 fairs. Unfortunately, none of those now take place today, but this area is still used for important events in the village. But we're now going to cross the marketplace and go and see one of the finest timber frame buildings in Britain, Lavenham Guildhall. So this is Lavenham Guildhall, the Guildhall of Corpus Christi, one of 4 religious guilds that once stood here in Lavenham. These were religious guilds, although trade would have been discussed here, as many members of the guild would have been rich cloth merchants. The guild received its charter from John de Vere, the Earl of Oxford, in 1529. And the building is an expression of the wealth of Lavenham at that time, with its fine carvings on the timbers around the doorway, its oriel windows and the fine carvings on the timbers. It didn't survive as a guild hall for very long, because in 1547 it was closed during the Reformation, and during the reign of Bloody Queen Mary it became a prison. And it was here that the Reverend Rowland Taylor, Vicar of Hadleigh, was held before being burned at the stake. During its time it has also been a town hall, a workhouse and a wool store. And during the Second World War, it was the welcome club for American airmen who were based at nearby Lavenham airfield. It also for a time housed evacuees. Today, Lavenham Guildhall is owned by the National Trust, and a visit inside is highly recommended. Inside you will learn the history of Lavenham and also the history of the cloth trade here.
With every step you take in Lavenham, you're just reminded of the wool trade and the wealth people made from it. By the time Henry VIII came to the throne, Lavenham was wealthy. In 1524, it ranked as the 14th wealthiest town, beating the likes of Lincoln and York. So many rich people lived here. In 1524, if you had an annual income of £10, you were considered very wealthy. And in Lavenham, there were nearly 50 people with such an income. This was your millionaire's row. One man, called Thomas Spring III, had an annual income of £3,200. He was the richest commoner outside of the city of London. He was so rich, Henry VIII taxed him twice, and he never complained. Mind you, that was probably rather wise of him. But then it all declined, and relatively quickly. Henry VIII's wars interrupted trade routes, and people wanted to wear a lighter weight woolen cloth rather than the heavyweight woolen cloth made here. Lavenham just did not keep up with the times. Fortunes declined, and consequently people did not have the money to alter or rebuild their houses. So because they became quite poor, we are left with a wealth of timber-framed buildings. If they appear familiar to you, well, they have appeared in films, including Harry Potter and the Deathly Hallows Part 1. Lavenham's houses form the backdrop of Harry's birthplace, Godric's Hollow. From films to nursery rhymes, have you ever sung Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star? The words were written by Jane Taylor, who lived with her sister Anne and family for a while in Lavenham. And they were friends with our artist, John Constable, who came to boarding school here for a time. A walk around Lavenham is a treat in itself, but take time to enjoy the shops and restaurants and pubs on offer, as well as the walks around the village too.
This is Little Hall. It's the oldest domestic hall house still open to the public, built for the rich clothiers of the time. But one thing that's really going to draw your attention to today is the door, which is a wicket door. And it's a big door, but there's a little door in the big door. Now, if I should have turned up with a huge roll of Lavenham cloth, you could have then opened up the big door and stored the wool in the house. But if I should have turned up on my own, you wouldn't have wanted to have let out precious heat from the house. So then the little door could be opened to let me through, rather than having to open this whole wide expansive door.
There is no natural stone in this area of the country. Therefore, 500 years ago, unless you were very rich, you could not afford to import large quantities of stone from other areas of the country or abroad to build your house. Bricks did not become available until the 1600s. Instead, the building material of choice was oak, which was readily available. Houses were built by creating an oak timber frame. The spaces in between the frame were then filled with wattle and daub. The wattles were hazel or ash sticks woven together to create infill panels. These were then daubed with a mixture of clay, horsehair, straw and cow dung. Both the timbers and the wattle and daub were then painted with lime wash to keep out the rain and protect the oak frame. In the late Tudor period, it became fashionable to plaster over the whole of the house on the outside. Timber frame houses were primarily constructed in the carpenter's workshop. Using green oak, each timber was cut to the required size and joints were made and numbered. The whole timber frame was now transported to site, and each side of the house was constructed on the ground like a large model kit, before all four sides were then raised and joined together. Joints were held together by wooden pegs, and the house was placed on top of a stone plinth to raise the frame above the ground. As you walk around the wool towns, you will notice that many of the timber-framed houses have a bigger upper floor that overhangs the ground floor. This overhang is known as a jetty. The reason for this is quite simple. Space in the walled towns was at a premium and house owners were taxed according to the area covered by the ground floor. It therefore made perfect sense to build a larger upper floor where the extra space taken above the street was tax-free.
Welcome to the parish church of St Peter of St Paul of Lavenham, and that's what it is. It's a parish church, but look at the size of it. It's more cathedral-like proportions that you might expect to see in a big city, rather than a parish church in a Suffolk town. Now, the lords of the manor of Lavenham were the De Veres. They subsequently got the title the Earls of Oxford, and they were quite enterprising lords of the manor, and they encouraged cottage industries and perhaps helped them the development of the cloth trade. Now, the 13th Earl of Oxford, he helped Henry Tudor come to the throne. He successfully helped him at the Battle of Bosworth. And when he came back to Lavenham, our 13th Earl suggested to the rich family, the Spring family, that they should rebuild and enhance the church. And the rich family did not say no to their lords of the manor. And look at this fine big church that we've got. Look at the tower as well. It's a really tall tower, but there are 5-pronged stars on that tower, and those 5-pronged stars are the mollet, and they're a symbol and they appear in the crest of the De Vere family. Also, along the battlements of the church, there are some crests, and they're of the rich families of the time that donated money, like the Spring family, and they've been preserved there forevermore. And the whole thing really is a showcase of the church built to the glory of God, and a showcase of the wealth that there was because of the wool trade.
So, a very large wool church here in Lavenham, but let's now go to the smallest town in Suffolk, but with another large church built with the wool money. Clare may be the smallest town in Suffolk, but it has a big history. William the Conqueror gave lands to Richard Fitzgilbert, including those of Clare in Suffolk, and Richard's family took on the name de Clare, but also made their mark on the town. They built a castle here, and they were amongst the wealthiest families in medieval times. They entertained royalty and even married into the royal family. Today, visitors can enjoy a peaceful walk through Clare Country Park, but there they see the high mound and ruined tower on top, which is all that is left of the once mighty and grand castle, but it is a timely reminder of Clare's important heritage. Clare is a walkers-a-welcome town, and there are many footpaths to explore here, including those to the River Stour or even along a former railway line. Clare once boasted a railway station within the grounds of its ruined castle, but although this closed in the 1960s, the listed buildings are still visible. In the town, the timbered architecture is a reminder of Clare's cloth-making past, as indeed is its grand church, which is another of our famous wall churches.
We're right next to the church in Clare, a huge church for a small town. Clare is a market town, and there has been a priory as well in Clare. The 13th century it was founded by Richard de Clare, then it was suppressed by Henry VIII, but in 1953 the Austin Friars returned to Clare. Clare is a market town, and there's lovely independent shops to enjoy here, as well as antique centres, and there's also a museum in the ancient house, and the ancient house is the building behind me. And look at its pargeting, the decorative raised plasterwork. Pargeting is supposed to come from the French word pageter, to throw over, but I'm sure you'll see it's anything but thrown over. It's beautiful designs, and you can find things like foliage, people, coats of arms, dates, and there's a lot of it found in Essex and Suffolk, and they are absolutely fine buildings. Now, if you think about it, you've got timber frame buildings here, and you've got your timbers, you've got your wattle and the daub. You've got your gap between the timber and the wattle and the daub, it's letting in the cold, but if you can put plaster in front of it, you kept yourself warm. And if you could afford to put decoration on that plaster work, well, that was even better. And if you could afford to do it, you did it.
Just a few miles east of Clare, can be discovered the quintessential Suffolk village of Cavendish. Like its larger neighbours, Cavendish also benefited from the wealth of the cloth trade in the 15th century, and many spinners and weavers employed in the cloth trade would have lived here. The lords of the manor in medieval times took their name from the village. The Cavendish family of Chatsworth and the Duke of Devonshire are direct descendants of this family. On Cavendish Green here we look across to one of the most iconic views here in Suffolk. The view of the almshouses, the lovely thatched almshouses dating back 400 years, the public house, the Five Bells thatched public house there, and then in the background the Church of St Mary the Virgin. The almshouses, 400 years old, have been managed by the George Savage Trust since 1957. George Savage was the son of a local farm labourer who went to London to marry and also made his fortune there in the hotel business. He later returned to this area, and when he died he left money in his will for the sick and the poor of Cavendish. The thatched cottages you will see are painted in the modern equivalent of Suffolk pink. Suffolk pink, however, has been around since the 1400s, and in the old days Suffolk pink was lime wash mixed with things like elderberries, blackthorn berries and sloe berries. Sometimes they used pig's blood and ox blood mixed with the lime wash to get the colour, and in actual fact traditional Suffolk pink was a much darker colour, almost red, compared to the more modern lighter candy pink that you see today. St Mary the Virgin Church dates from between 1300 and 1500. During the Peasants' Revolt in 1381, the Lord of the Manor, Sir John Cavendish, was Chief Justice of the King's Bench and therefore a supporter of the dreaded poll tax. After the death of Wat Tyler, leader of the Peasants' Revolt, Sir John Cavendish was chased by the mob, and he ran to the church here, tried to grab hold of the handle of the church and claim sanctuary. Unfortunately, his attempt failed and he was captured by the peasants, taken to Bury St Edmunds, where he was executed. He had his head chopped off. This, however, benefited the village because in his will he left money for the rebuilding of the church chancel. So now we're going to leave Cavendish and head to Long Melford, where we will hear the story of two manor houses, another magnificent church, and we will tell you about this area's connection with Lovejoy, the TV series.
The long village street of Melford certainly puts the long in its name. Considered to be one of the longest in the country, it once linked two settlements, but now we know the whole as Long Melford. This is another of our beautiful villages of the Stour Valley, and certainly not one to be missed. It is full of history, and that can be explored in further detail in the Heritage Centre. The money from the wool trade, though, is seen today by the huge parish church, as well as the fact that Long Melford has not one, but two Tudor manor houses which are open to visitors. One is called Kentwell Hall, which is a moated manor house famous for its gardens, farm and special reenactment days. The other is Melford Hall, run today by the National Trust.
Looking now north across the village green here at Long Melford, we see the Holy Blessed Trinity Hospital, built in 1573 by Sir William Cordell of Melford Hall. Some say partly to hide the church that had been built by his great rival John Clopton. The hospital was built for the poor and sick of Melford, and even today it is the home of 11 elderly people from the village. Behind the hospital can be seen the Holy Trinity Church. So here we have Holy Trinity Church, said to be one of the finest wall churches in East Anglia. The main body of the church was built in the late 15th century, although the tower that you see here was not built until 1903. It replaced a previous tower destroyed by fire. The church was largely paid for by John Clopton, Lord of the Manor of Kentwell Hall. Now, during the War of the Roses, he had been held in the Tower of London, along with his friend the Earl of Oxford, for treason. Fortunately, he was released without charge, and it's said that in thanksgiving for this, he lavishly spent on this church. If you decide to visit the church and go inside, you will see some wonderful examples of medieval stained glass, and also the Clopton Chantry Chapel. Inside the Clopton Chantry Chapel, you will see the tomb of Sir William Clopton, father of John Clopton. Sir William was also Lord of the Manor of Hadleigh, and he gave land to Hadleigh to build a Guildhall and create a marketplace. He charged a peppercorn rent for this, which was one red rose to be placed on his tomb for eternity. That ceremony, the ceremony of the red rose, still takes place every year in July, when the Mayor of Hadleigh comes to the church here to place the red rose on Sir William's tomb. It is said to be the oldest rent still being paid in Britain.
It's a lovely village green at Long Melford, and the turrets of Melford Hall have stood looking over this village green for about 500 years. Long Melford certainly prospered in the wool trade. That's shown by the houses, and by the fact there are 2 manor halls in Melford today. Kentwell Hall, in private ownership but open to visitors, and Melford Hall, run by the National Trust but lived in by the Hyde Parker family. Melford Hall has had a story, from medieval monks to Elizabeth I, to Beatrix Potter visiting, to the Hyde Parker family. Originally, the site was the country residence of the abbots of nearby Bury St Edmunds. After Henry VIII dissolved the religious houses, it eventually came to William Cordell, son of a cloth merchant and rising star in Tudor circles. So much so that Elizabeth I came to visit him in Melford in 1578. Oh, but she did not come on her own. No, she brought a retinue of 2,000 with her and nearly bankrupted poor Mr. Cordell. In 1786, the Hyde Parker family took on ownership, and their cousin by marriage was Beatrix Potter, the author. She came to visit, and no doubt enchanted the young Hyde Parker children with her stories. Another famous Hyde Parker was Admiral Sir Hyde Parker, who in 1801 commanded the fleet at the Battle of Copenhagen. Now, his second in command was a certain Horatio Nelson. Admiral Hyde Parker hoisted the flag to discontinue the action, but reportedly Nelson ignored the order from his commander by raising the telescope to his blind eye and exclaiming, "I really do not see the signal." He pressed on and won.
The road through the centre of Long Melford was once the main road between Bury St Edmunds and Sudbury. The Bull Hotel, built in around 1450, became a coaching inn in 1570. One famous visitor who stayed at this hotel was Ian McShane, the actor who played Lovejoy in the TV series. And of course, Long Melford and the villages in this area were used in that film. But possibly the most famous visitors to the Bull were John Lennon and Yoko Ono. In December 1969, they arrived here at the Bull in Long Melford to stay for a short while they filmed at Lavenham. And the film they did involved a hot air balloon taking off from Lavenham Marketplace. The film was called Apotheosis. But while they were here, they were also being filmed by a BBC television crew for a documentary. John Lennon and Yoko Ono are seen going in to the hotel and booking themselves in as Mr. and Mrs. Smith, and also they are filmed sitting up in bed together. Following the decline of the cloth trade, Long Melford managed to retain much of its wealth. This was in part due to its location on the main Bury St Edmunds to Sudbury Road. The Stour Valley Railway arrived at Long Melford in 1865, and other industries were established here, including the malting of barley, agricultural engineering, horsehair weaving and coconut mat making. Later, Long Melford was to become a major centre for antiques. But now we visit Sudbury, where the weaving of wool was replaced by the weaving of silk.
We arrive in the market town of Sudbury on the banks of the Stour. It is here that the famous artist Thomas Gainsborough was born, and his childhood home is now a museum dedicated to him. Sudbury also has a few literary connections, as amongst others it has been visited by the authors Charles Dickens and Dodie Smith, and it was also the birthplace of a 14th century Archbishop of Canterbury, who unfortunately lost his head in the Peasants' Revolt of 1381. Sudbury is one of our wall towns, but amongst its special attractions is that Sudbury is still weaving today. It's not wool, but it's silk. This is England's silk weaving capital.
Welcome to the Weaver's Piece in Sudbury. A little bit of green space in the town and a reminder of the weaving trade that has been so important to the town, from making the money from the heavyweight to the lighter weight woolen cloth. But in the 18th century, we've got redundant wool weavers. They were poor, they were desperate for money. Now, on the other hand, in 18th century in Spitalfields in London, you had silk weavers rebelling, and they wanted more money. That led to the passing of the Spitalfields Act that regulated their wages. But the factory owners in Spitalfields just thought, well, actually, why don't we move out of London? And why don't we move to areas not too far from London, but where there are redundant weavers that would be happy to weave silk? And so that's what they did. They moved to Sudbury and to other areas and wove silk. So from wool, we suddenly wove silk. And where Sudbury is so special, they are still weaving silk in the town today. And if you see, sometimes the celebrities have been seen in dresses made of silk from Sudbury, the royal family. If you go to some of the big palaces and houses, some of the soft furnitures are from silk that has been woven in Sudbury. And what is so special, so we sometimes say we are the silk weaving capital of the country because we are still weaving silk here today. And it's just a timely reminder that from the weaving trade that has been so important to this area, we are still weaving silk in the Stour Valley today. Now, there are various buildings around Sudbury that are associated with the silk trade. It was a cottage industry, the 3-storey buildings where the looms would be against the big window in the middle to let as much light in as possible. But when the looms became bigger and heavier, then they built what we call silk manufactories. And the building behind me is a former one of those silk manufactories where people could work in a factory rather than in a cottage. Weaver's Piece has got boards here detailing the wool industry to the silk industry. And then these rod bollards go around the town, and there's a Talbot trail you can follow that details all the history around the town. And these particular ones here in Weaver's Piece are, of course, about weaving.
Standing here on Market Hill in the centre of Sudbury is the National Memorial to Thomas Gainsborough, Sudbury's most famous son, born here in 1727. The statue is by Sir Bertram McKennell and was unveiled here in June 1913 by Princess Louise, the Duchess of Argyll. The statue shows Thomas Gainsborough resting his paintbrush on his easel and contemplating Sudbury and gazing down the street towards his family home. The picture on the front of the statue here is said to be a depiction of his painting of Mrs. Sheridan. The only difference is that in this picture she is holding a musical instrument. At the rear of the monument you will see St. Peter's Church, now an important community centre and cultural hub for Sudbury. To the left, we're now going to walk round and have a look at a water trough that played a starring role in a popular children's novel. So this is the water trough and drinking fountain that played a starring role in the children's novel 101 Dalmatians. Dodie Smith, the author, lived not far from here and often visited Sudbury. So in her book, Pongo and Mrs., the two Dalmatians, are making their way from London. They're on their way to Suffolk to rescue their puppies from Cruella de Vil at Hell Hall. And following the twilight barking, they arrive at the River Stour and cross the River Stour into Suffolk, making their way here to the marketplace, where they stop to drink. And as they drink, the clock of St. Peter's Church strikes midnight. On the drinking fountain is in memory of Dodie Smith and tells the story of the part this drinking fountain played in 101 Dalmatians.
Sudbury is on the banks of the River Stour, and there are lovely walks on meadows around the town. The river is a natural divide between the counties of Suffolk and Essex, so let us take this opportunity to cross the Stour into Essex and visit another walled town which later wove lace.
Crossing the River Stour into Essex and a few miles east of Braintree, we arrive at the medieval wall town of Coggeshall. Like its neighbours in Suffolk, the town made its wealth from the cloth trade, and it contains over 200 listed buildings. Many of these buildings are timber framed, and Coggeshall is often said to be the Essex equivalent of Lavenham in Suffolk. At the request of Queen Matilda, wife of King Stephen, an abbey was built here in 1140, and the Cistercian monks who lived at the abbey were successful sheep farmers and breeders. This success was the beginning of the woolen and cloth trade that would bring significant wealth to the town. Just a 5-minute walk from the town centre can be found the Grange Barn, which was once part of the abbey complex. It is now owned by the National Trust and is open to the public. This is one of the oldest timber frame structures in Europe, and some of its timbers are over 900 years old. The production of cloth, silk and velvet were once the mainstays of Coggeshall's economy, with over half of its population employed in producing one of these textiles. Coggeshall was particularly well known for its Coggeshall white cloth, and a census carried out in 1851 showed the town to be one of the most industrialised places in Essex. However, a ban was lifted on imported silk in 1826, and that dealt a catastrophic blow to the town. Unable to compete, its production of silk virtually stopped. Lace making, though, was to be the next success for Coggeshall, with the introduction of tambour lace by a Monsieur Drago in 1812. The production of lace in the town died out after World War II, but examples of it were worn by both Queen Mary and by Queen Elizabeth II. A fine landmark of the town is the Church of St. Peter ad Vincula, located on the site of an earlier Norman church. It was built in the 15th century with money made from the wool industry, and is a statement of the wealth enjoyed by the town at that time. It is one of the largest churches in Essex, and the church bells are said to have the loudest peal in the county. Another landmark in the town is the 14th century clock house in the old town square, formerly a school for the poor children of the town. And nearby is the Coggeshall Museum and Heritage Centre, where the full story of this fascinating town can be discovered.
One of the must-see places to visit in Coggeshall is Paycocke's House and Gardens, now owned by the National Trust. This is a stunning timber frame building built around 1500. The Paycocke family originally came from Suffolk, and Thomas Paycocke, who the house was built for, was a very wealthy cloth merchant, and this house really is a showcase of his wealth. It is one of the finest examples of a cloth merchant's house in East Anglia. The house itself features beautiful wood panelling and carvings, and on some of the wooden beams inside can still be seen the initials of Thomas and his wife Margaret. Lord Noel Buxton, a descendant of a family who once occupied the house in the late 16th century, gave the house to the National Trust in 1924, and the house has now been fully restored and is open to the public.
We now cross back over the River Stour and into Suffolk. Incidentally, although the River Stour is spelt Stour, we are using the local pronunciation, Stour. Indeed, the county of Suffolk does have its own unique dialect, which can still be heard in many towns and villages. Listen out for it as you journey through the Stour Valley. Surrounding the walled towns of the Stour Valley, the rolling countryside is perfect for exploring by bicycle or on foot, with its quiet country lanes, marked cycle routes and a vast network of footpaths. Nestled amongst this landscape can be found many more picture-perfect villages. These include Monk's Eleigh and Chelsworth with their many thatched cottages. And then of course there is Kersey, so beautiful that it's been named among the top 10 villages in Britain. Now, like all villages in the Stour Valley, Kersey is best explored on foot, followed perhaps by a pint at the local pub. Running down both sides of a steep valley, Kersey is noted for its picturesque ford in the centre of the village and is one of the places that all tourists have on their must-visit list. The ford is known locally as the Splash and has appeared in film and on TV, most notably in the Lovejoy series. The village is dominated by the 12th century church on the hill, and from the church steps there you get great views of the Splash and the main village street. Kersey is essentially a medieval village built on the wealth of the cloth industry, and it had a type of cloth named after it. Kerseys were a form of coarse twill broadcloth, exported throughout Europe and often used for army greatcoats and uniforms, as well as for woolen stockings and hose. Just 2.5 miles from Kersey is the wool town of Hadleigh, once the centre of the Viking King Guthrum's kingdom. We will now discover more about this important wool town.
We've just come off the main street of Hadleigh, and here we've got 3 very distinctive buildings, all different architecture, but all built around the same time and all very central to Hadleigh's story. Now, straight ahead, you've got a lovely tower. It's a very tall tower, about 52 feet in height, and it's known as the Deanery Tower. And actually, it looks like a little bit of Hampton Court in a Suffolk town. Well, in 1495, we had a rector here called Archdeacon Paycocke, and he had a vision to build himself a grand palace. And he built this gatehouse, and then he died. And so the palace never came to fruition. But that is just a reminder of what there might have been in Hadleigh. Now, opposite the church, you've got a lovely building, and it's a complex of buildings that we know in Hadleigh as the Guild Hall. They date from the 15th century with a Victorian building behind. Just shows the wealth, though, in Hadleigh in the 15th century. Now, we've got a market town, and the rent for the market, you might remember when we were in Long Melford, they paid a red rose on a tomb in the church in Long Melford, and it's Hadleigh that pay that rent of the red rose. But going back to that fine building, it is beautiful. It's been used, though, for a variety of purposes over the years, including a workhouse, a prison, it's been a school. Even in the early 20th century, it's been a corset factory. Now it's a working building, but you can rent the rooms for weddings, parties, exhibitions. In fact, Ian's dad had a really special birthday party in there, didn't he, Ian?
Yes, my father celebrated his 90th birthday at the Guildhall, a fantastic historic setting for a birthday party. But now let's look at the Church of St Mary's here in Hadleigh, another of the magnificent wall churches of Suffolk. But this is the only one with a spire, dating from the 14th century. The whole church was built in the 14th century, although it was significantly rebuilt in the 15th century. If you look up at the tower, just above the clock, you will see a bell. It is the oldest church bell in Suffolk, dating from 1280. The church itself is one of the longest churches in Suffolk, and it had to be because it housed 5 chantry altars for the religious guilds of Hadleigh. St Mary's Church was painted by Thomas Gainsborough, and it also appeared in a landscape of John Constable's. And we are now off to Constable country, the 12 square miles around the village of East Bergholt, John Constable's birthplace.
We're now in East Bergholt, and East Bergholt is in the heart of Constable country. With the cloth trade, there's some lovely big buildings in the village that are a reminder of the wealth that there was here in the cloth trade. But now, East Bergholt is most famous because of its associations with our painter John Constable. He was born in this village. He was born in 1776. He was the fourth of 6 children. And he once described his childhood with his 2 brothers and his 3 sisters as his careless boyhood. Now, we're by the church of St Mary here in East Bergholt, which would have been a familiar sight to our young painter. And it's a fine church. But one thing you might notice about it is the lack of a tower. Now, the story goes about the tower that Cardinal Wolsey, right-hand man of Henry VIII, and he was born in Suffolk. Now, when he fell from grace and died, there was no money for the tower. And what do you put in a church tower? Well, bells, of course. So in 1530s, the villagers built a temporary structure for the bells. And that bell cage is still here today. Let's go and look at it. This is the temporary structure that was built to house the bells. And as you can see, it's still in the churchyard today. And the bells that are here are still rung, but they can't be rung in the traditional way because they're not up the tower. People stand next to them and manipulate the bells. They're rung by hand, and it's quite a sight to see, particularly if you come on a Sunday when they ring the bells in the morning. This is a lovely churchyard, and it's a really quiet place, really central, obviously, to the Constable country story. His parents are buried in this churchyard, John Constable's parents. Also, this is the burial site, place of Willie Lott. You know Willie Lott's house? And his house appears in the most famous painting, the Hay Wain. From here, you can easily walk down a lovely country lane opposite to get towards Flatford. Flatford is where John Constable's father owned a mill and where John Constable painted a lot of the scenes along the River Stour. And his most famous painting, the Hay Wain, the site of that is at Flatford. And you can also continue along the river if you want to get towards Dedham, another of our famous wool towns.
The famous places which form the heart of a Constable country tour are East Bergholt, Flatford and Dedham. The site of Flatford is looked after by the National Trust, and whilst at Flatford, do take the time to visit the scenes of several of John Constable's paintings, including boat building, as well as the most famous of them all, the site of the Hay Wain. Flatford Mill was owned by John Constable's father Golding, and John himself spent a year working there, and so the scenes around the Stour would have been very familiar to our artist, particularly the life of the working river. You can continue your walk from Flatford to Dedham following the line of the river. As you do, just bear in mind you are following in the footsteps of our young painter as he walked from his home at East Bergholt to his school at Dedham. As you cross the river, you are crossing into Essex, and now it is time to visit Dedham, another of our wall towns.
So here we are in the centre of Dedham in Royal Square, and here we have a good view of the High Street, and on the opposite side of the High Street you'll see some fine Georgian style buildings with their equally spaced windows, their brick frontages, and also their rather elaborate front doors. If you were to step through those doors into the house beyond, you would be stepping into a medieval timber framed building. When the cloth trade collapsed here in Dedham, Dedham continued to be wealthy, not because of new industry, but because of its 2 schools. These 2 schools resulted in many wealthy people moving here into the village, and they bought these old medieval timber frame buildings and they made them more fashionable by adding a Georgian style frontage. The 2 schools here in Dedham were the grammar school, which was the school where John Constable came as a boy, walked from East Bergholt each morning to school each day. The other school here was the English or Writing School, which was situated in what is now known as Sherman's Hall, opposite the church.
Sherman's Hall is named after the wealthy cloth merchant Edmund Sherman, who left money in his will to found the writing school here in 1601. The school closed in the 19th century and it then became a house. It is a medieval timber frame building, but hidden by an elaborate brick frontage that was added in 1731. The urn in the niche above the doorway commemorates Edmund Sherman and also Marshal Sisson, a prominent architect who left this house to the National Trust in 1979. Members of the Sherman family from Dedham left for America in the 1620s during what is known as the Great Migration. People from this area helped to found the state of Massachusetts, and the best known member of the Sherman family was the American Civil War General William Sherman. In the centre of Dedham stands the 15th century Wool Church of St Mary's. The tower of the church appears in many of John Constable's paintings of the local landscape. And inside the church can be found an original Constable painting. This is a religious scene called the Ascension, which he painted for his uncle. Of course, no visit to Dedham is complete without a visit to Castle House, home of the Munnings Art Museum, just a mile from the village centre. Sir Alfred Munnings, the famous horse and landscape painter, lived in Dedham for 40 years until his death in 1959. Castle House was his home here, and the museum contains the largest collection of his work in the world.
Well, I hope you've enjoyed our tour of the wool towns here in the Stour Valley. As you've seen on this film, there is a wealth of architecture here, wonderful timber frame buildings and those wonderful wool churches. The cloth trade here in the Stour Valley declined rapidly. Many of the towns were able to develop new industries, but many more remained poor for a long period of time. Their lavish cloth merchants' houses fell into decline. Some were divided up into small tenements. Some were taken down and removed. And others received a Georgian frontage, as was the fashion in the 18th century. Later, as the wealth returned, many people came back to these villages and lovingly restored these timber-framed houses, which we can all enjoy today. The wool towns of the Stour Valley are great places to visit. They are also wonderful places to stay. You can use them as a base for exploring the wonderful countryside and the landscape of the area of outstanding natural beauty.
Thank you very much for joining us, and we hope that you will come and visit the Stour Valley. There's plenty of places to see and do. There's plenty of walks you can do as well. You can join an organised guided walk, or you can do your own walk around the area. There's plenty of leaflets that you can pick up or download. Most importantly, we thank you for joining us, and we hope that you will come and visit, and we hope that you really will enjoy the wool towns of the Stour Valley. Thank you.